In this episode of Paper Skies, we will discuss: is it wrong to compare the Soviet Union and Germany? What part of the human brain is used to resist propaganda? What is the Chief Osceola jump? What was the most memorable episode of my trip to Moscow in 1986? And finally, what is the name of my new channel covering the history of Russia? As you can see, today's video is not quite the usual, and you bet it is indeed not. This video won't have the usual aviation story, although this episode is in a way an afterword to my previous video about the Soviet Tu-4 bomber, as some furious comments prompted me to make this video. Of course, there were many more positive comments, which I appreciate and am truly grateful for. The video about the Soviets copying the American bomber has gained good views, by the standards of my channel of course. In fact, the number of views is higher than usual. In just a month after being released, the video brought in more new subscribers than most of my older videos do in years. More importantly, after its release, the video was reviewed and confirmed to be suitable for YouTube, something that doesn't happen very often. All in all, everything is going well. I could not ask for more. The reason for the current video is some viewers' reaction to my statement in the previous video about the US and Britain deciding to unite with a lesser evil, namely the USSR, to defeat a greater one, though it is debatable whether it was indeed the lesser evil. I got quite a few comments in regards to that statement of mine, which I have decided to address. I will use this particular comment as a reference, as it combines together all the matters that I want to discuss. I have long been accustomed to and quit paying attention to various angry comments usually left by one particular ethnic group, or race. My apologies, according to recent trends this is now a race, not a nationality. By the way, it's funny to see this comment under a video telling how the Russians bluntly copied an American bomber without understanding the technology, and here the Russians in comments are mimicking Western blame words without understanding the actual meaning of the words. Anyway, this time I noticed that some of these comments weren't left by Russians, but by people from, let's call it, the civilized part of the world. So today I'd like to discuss every part of this comment, including inner repressions, the gulags and all that shit, and of course comparing Soviet Union to Nazi Germany. But don't worry, I'm not going to drown you in boring numbers or heavy citations. No, we will operate with some straightforward and comprehensible matters and facts that even an idiot can understand. And the definition of an idiot is what I suggest we start with. To save some time, I simply took the first result that Google provided me with, so here are the 5 signs of a stupid person. The reason I start with this definition is an expression that I highly recommend you learn. Propaganda doesn't make people stupid, it is made for already stupid people. This expression applies to all kinds of propaganda, but especially to Russian propaganda. Unlike, let's call it, Western propaganda, which due to media freedom has to use tools like half-truth or selective truth, Russian propaganda mostly consists of outright blunt lies. These lies are usually very easy to verify, but a huge number of people are incapable of even that. Why? Check the signs of a stupid person. The good news is that the ability to resist propaganda, although varying from person to person, is nonetheless inherent in everyone. Therefore, whether one believes in Russian propaganda, or in other words, whether one chooses to remain an idiot or not, is always a personal choice. This judgment is based on a recent study by scientists of Cambridge University, who assessed the brain activity of more than 1,000 Russians in response to official statements from the Russian government. It turned out that the difference between those who blindly believed Vladimir Putin and those who saw his statements as complete idiocy lay in the activity of one specific part of the brain called the imbecillus. Oh, I almost forgot about the 5th sign of a stupid person, a complete lack of a sense of humor. Very important sign, sorry I missed it earlier. Let's continue. In people who believed Putin, the imbecillus became highly active, releasing huge amounts of happiness hormone. In contrast, those who didn't believe the Russian propaganda experienced a brain reaction that suppressed the activity of the imbecillus, accompanied by a feeling of a great discomfort, similar to the feeling you experience when someone takes you for an idiot. Another important thing was that these occasions of the brain suppressing the imbecillus often left a lasting memory due to the level of discomfort they caused. I can personally relate to this, as I vividly remember the first such situation that happened to me way back while in Soviet elementary school. We used to have so-called singing classes, where we would learn and sing together various Soviet songs for children. You know, those ones about a happy Soviet childhood, golden sun and the blue sky, and then those where we would sing how we would all happily burn to ashes, fighting for the cause of our beloved Vladimir Lenin. Anyway, one of my favorite songs back then was the song Legendary Sevastopol, about the city where our grandfathers fiercely fought in many battles, glorifying for ages this impregnable city. Here is the song. Great song, amazing music, easy to memorize poetry, a highly skillful, without any exaggeration, piece of Russian propaganda. It is indeed, until you're done with singing and go to your history lesson, where you learn that throughout its entire history Sevastopol has never withstood a single enemy siege. Every single historical episode where an enemy besieged Sevastopol, whether it was the Crimean War or World War II or any other war or conflict, the enemy sooner or later conquered Sevastopol. Literally every single time, with no exceptions. And here, for the first time, I felt the imbecilamos activity in my brain. I understand that back then some of the children may not have been aware yet of the exact meaning of the word impregnable, which is okay, they were still in school after all. But making this song the official anthem of Sevastopol, I think tells you something about the Russian nation. Or race, race, my apologies once again. But the Sevastopol story was just the beginning. To be honest, studying history in school was one of the most memorable experiences in this regard. At the beginning of almost every section of our school textbook, we were once again reminded that the Russians were the most peaceful people on earth, that we didn't need a single piece of other nation's land, yet by the end of the chapter, we had to learn and memorize the new, expanded borders of our peaceful homeland. It was especially challenging when studying the so-called Great Patriotic War, known in the civilized world as World War II. On the one hand, we were once again the most peaceful nation which had been dishonorably attacked by Germany. Despite that, however, after suffering some losses, we managed to fight back and liberate not only our beloved motherland but also other countries previously enslaved by the fascists. Yet somehow during that liberation process our country once again became bigger. And I don't mean the countries that fell under the Soviet influence, but the actual borders of the USSR, the only allied country whose size increased compared to the beginning of World War II. Of course, it was explained to us that living in Russia was so great that everyone simply wanted to join us. In this regard, one particularly interesting section of school history was the so-called inclusion of Siberia. Not conquest or colonization, but specifically inclusion. The fact that during this historical inclusion the indigenous nations of Siberia were either significantly reduced in population or simply ceased to exist was not mentioned either in school history nor in any other version of Russian history up until today. And not that we weren't aware of such terms as colonization, enslavement, and extermination of indigenous peoples. We knew them perfectly well from the chapters covering the European colonization of North America. Cementing those narratives was the movie industry, particularly the so-called Red Westerns or Easterns, films produced in Yugoslavia and East Germany about, as we call them, Indians versus cowboys. Those movies were extremely popular. To put it in today's context, being Chief Winnie 2 in our boys' games was something like being Spider-Man or Wolverine today. Jumping into water as a cannonball was fun, but not as cool as a Chief Aziola jump. And I'm telling this as one who has completed hundreds of such jumps, which I'm starting to think now may have somehow affected my imbecilamus. Anyway, I can go on and on with my personal experiences, but my main point is that moments of feeling like you're being taken for an idiot when dealing with Russian propaganda will happen to everyone, regardless of their age, education level, ethnicity, or anything else. The only difference is each person's capacity for how many such situations they can tolerate before reaching the point of enough is enough, allowing them eventually to recognize and resist Russian propaganda. And everyone will eventually reach that point when learning Russian history, because as I mentioned earlier, Russian propaganda is made for idiots and is largely based on simple lies that are easy to disprove. unless of course no changes are made to these 5 points. And now, keeping in mind everything that we just discussed, let's go back to that comment and compare Nazi Germany with the USSR, and while we do that, try to notice if there is any discomfort in your brain. As I promised, today we'd discuss things in simple terms, and fortunately, there exists one universal set of values that we can use to make a simple comparison between the Nazis and the Soviets, no matter your attitude to those systems. It is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted as a common standard for all peoples and all nations, and commits nations to recognize all humans as being born free and equal in dignity and rights, regardless of nationality, place of residence, sex, color, religion, language, or any other status. In fact, this declaration was developed as a response to the atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II. In 1948, it was accepted by the United Nations, with 48 members voting in favor and 8 abstaining. It would seem that the Soviet Union, who proclaimed itself as a defender of those oppressed and enslaved, would be a primary promoter of the Human Rights Declaration, yet out of those 8 countries that abstained in the voting, 6 were the Soviet Union and its satellites. Moreover, in the USSR, that very best country in the world, the Declaration of Human Rights was considered illegal, and distribution of the declaration or even its excerpts would result in arrest and imprisonment for anti-Soviet propaganda and distribution of false statements that discredit the Soviet state. It was only on September 5, 1991 that the Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the USSR. Just to remind you that 3 months later, in December 1991, the USSR ceased to exist. This was, by the way, the first test for your imbecilamus. Did you notice anything? Anyway, as I've promised, we won't bury ourselves in complex peculiarities of the ideologies, but rather talk about some straightforward matters understandable to pretty much anyone older than 16. And the first matter I want to talk about when comparing Nazi Germany with the USSR is that you could leave Nazi Germany. Yep, pretty much up until the beginning of World War II, you could just buy a ticket on a train or a steamboat or a plane and simply leave Germany. You could sell all your belongings, your property, buy a foreign currency and use all that money to leave Germany and start a new life in another country. Of course, that's not an easy decision to make, but at least you had that choice. Meanwhile, in the USSR, that would have been simply impossible. The fact that there was no private property in the USSR and thus you couldn't own or sell it is fairly well known. A less known fact is that possessing or exchanging foreign currency was illegal, and depending on the decade, it could lead to either imprisonment or the death penalty. As for leaving the USSR, let me tell you a short story. One of the most well-known and glorified figures in Soviet history was a border guard named Nikita Karatsupa. Poems and songs were written about border guard Karatsupa. He was celebrated in countless books and movies, deservedly so it seemed, as during his service in the 1930s, hero of the USSR Nikita Karatsupa personally detained 467 people attempting to cross the Soviet border, 129 of whom he shot dead. What Soviet propaganda conveniently omitted was that the most of these border violators weren't trying to break into the USSR, but were actually trying to escape the so-called Soviet paradise. Leaving the USSR of your own will was a crime, and starting in 1935 it was punishable by death. Interestingly, that same year the Soviet government passed a law extending the death penalty to minors as young as 12 years old. How's your brain? Any tickling in the imbecilamus area? It seems that in light of the Declaration of Human Rights, in particular Article 13, the Soviet Union wasn't that good of a country. One might even say it was even worse than Nazi Germany. But let's continue. Another difference was that when the Nazis came to power, they significantly changed the political and ideological structure of German society, while leaving the economic foundation largely unchanged. Yes, big businesses had to adjust and cooperate with the new regime, but for the average person, nothing much changed. The typical factory workers continued to work as they did before. The peasant kept working on their plot of land just like before. Small businesses carried on with their usual operations, and professionals like engineers, teachers, lawyers, or scientists continued providing their services. Most importantly, workers were still paid for their labor, and if they didn't like the work conditions, whether it was the pay, the location, or anything else, they could simply find another job or even choose not to work at all. These seemingly basic conditions, which most of you take for granted today, were not available to Soviet people at all. In the USSR, quitting a job of your own will was forbidden, and starting in 1940, it became a criminal offense. On June 26, 1940, the Soviet government passed a law titled "On the Transition to an 8-Hour Workday, a 7-Day Work Week, and the Prohibition of Unauthorized Resignation by Workers and Employees." According to this law, quitting a job or transferring to a new one was only allowed with the permission of the state enterprise director. Unauthorized resignation of your own will was forbidden and punishable by up to 4 months of imprisonment. Moreover, missing a workday without a valid reason was punishable by correctional labor for up to 6 months with a 25% reduction in wages. Just a month later, in September 1940, the law was amended to include a provision that, in case of repeat offenses, the term of correctional labor would be converted into a prison sentence. Additionally, being late to work or returning from lunch more than 20 minutes late or leaving work early by the same amount of time was now considered a missed working day. However, even these measures were deemed insufficient, and 4 months later, in January 1941, the law was further expanded to punish workers for refusing job transfers, including to lower-paying positions, as well as for refusing to work overtime. Just to remind you, it was still a peaceful time, and the USSR was not yet in a state of war. After the German invasion, the law was updated by increasing the term of imprisonment from 4 months to 8 years. Essentially, with the passing of that law, the Soviet people were now tied to their workplace for life, which, if you look at the legal definition, was nothing other than slavery. According to a report by the USSR Attorney General Viktor Bachkov, less than 2 months after the law was passed in June 1940, more than 1 million violations were submitted to the courts, of which over 900,000 resulted in conviction. This law remained in effect in the USSR for 16 years, during which 18 million people were convicted under it. Just think about that number. 18 million people convicted for not wanting to work at their job or for being 20 minutes late to work. And it's important to clarify that in 1956 it wasn't the law itself that was repealed, but only the prison sentence, which was replaced by wage cuts. However, Soviet citizens continued to be tied to their workplaces. It's no surprise that in the USSR the Declaration of Human Rights was considered illegal, as its articles regarding working rights and slavery simply break to pieces the glorious image of the world's first state of workers and peasants. Any tingling sensation in your brain, by the way? You know, when I hear Russians angrily arguing that comparing Nazis and Soviets is unacceptable because they are not the same, I agree with them, though only to a certain extent. There are indeed significant differences between Nazis and Soviets. As history has shown, Hitler primarily killed people of other nations, while Stalin largely targeted his own. Hitler's Nazis killed people based on their ethnicity, driven by the delusional and criminal idea of the superiority of the Aryan race. In contrast, Stalin's communists were killing people based on their belonging to anti-revolutionary social classes, guided by the delusional and criminal theory of the supremacy of revolutionary expediency over formal legality. And the scale of mass repression in pre-war Germany and the USSR was simply incomparable. Stalin exterminated far more people. For instance, in just 1937-1938 alone, 800,000 so-called enemies of the people were shot or tortured to death during interrogations. But I know what you're going to say. These are numbers stupidly inflated by Western propaganda. And although the author of this comment thinks he made a bold statement here, this is where my brain starts to hurt. Inflated compared to what? You see, when you say inflated, it implies that you have something to compare it to. To claim that the figures regarding the human losses of the USSR during the repressions or World War II or all that shit are inflated, you'd need to have the actual archival numbers, right? I remember very well when on January 18, 2020, Vladimir Putin, during a meeting with World War II veterans, boldly declared, we will shut the mouth of those who try to rewrite history. Those filthy mouths which some people overseas open to achieve their political goals, we will shut them with our truthful archival information. Putin spoke harshly and just a few months later issued a decree extending the secrecy of Soviet archives related to World War II until 2040. According to Russian law, a state secret is protected information, the disclosure of which could harm the security of the Russian Federation. Now just think about how archival documents on a war that ended 80 years ago, fought between Nazi Germany, a country that no longer exists, and the USSR, a country that also no longer exists, could harm the security of the Russian Federation. Did I already ask about your brain? Okay, I understand you don't trust the inflated numbers from the West. Let's look at the official numbers from Russia. For example, here's an official statement from the Russian parliament in April 2008 in regards to the famine of the 1930s. Let's read it together. As a result of the famine caused by forced collectivization, many regions of Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus suffered. Due to famine and diseases associated with malnutrition, approximately 7 million people died in these areas between 1932 and 1933. 7 million people killed in just 1 year, in just one single episode of Soviet history. Not due to war, nor a natural disaster of any kind, but solely because of one socialist experiment. In this 1 year, the USSR killed 2 million more Soviet civilians than those who died in 3 years under Nazi occupation on Soviet territory. That's also 1 million more than all the victims killed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Just take a second to process this information. And I remind you, this is not some inflated Western propaganda number, but an official statement of Russia. So if you still think that comparing Nazis and Soviets, who killed more of their own civilians than Nazis did, is mentally ill, I don't know if any other facts can change your mind. This document is actually a great example of how trustworthy Russia is that you can check for yourself if you'd like. The document that I showed you is a scanned copy of the actual statement issued by the Russian parliament. However, to find it, you need to dig through the archive and locate it among thousands of other documents. But if you check the news section on the Russian parliament's official website regarding that same statement, you will notice that the 7 million figure has magically disappeared, along with any mention of the cause of the famine. Let's do one more thing. Imagine you didn't see the actual document that I showed you previously, and you're just reading this news. How many of you, after reading these neutrally written sentences about the famine, all of a sudden thought it was definitely an ethnic genocide? The Russians obviously think there should be quite a few, because literally the very next paragraph says that don't you dare start thinking it was a genocide. Remember, Russian propaganda doesn't make you into an idiot. It is made for idiots. There's one more statement about the USSR in this comment under my video that I of course could not pass by. There's no freaking way that the country that endured such good life standards for their own people could be compared to Nazi Germany. Such good life standards. Funny enough, this seemingly most ridiculous and obvious nonsense is actually the hardest to disprove. It's like a person pointing at the moon, calling it the sun, and asking you to prove otherwise. So, in regards to the good life standards, here is me taking the young pioneer's oath. A special day for me back then, as I was one step closer to becoming a true communist. Today, however, I really like the expression, when I was a pioneer, I was told how great my life would be in 40 years. Now, 40 years later, I am told how great my life was when I was a pioneer. In 1986, I traveled with my father to Moscow, where he had some businesses in the Ministry of Defense. I was so excited for this amazing chance to go to the capital of our beloved motherland, to see the Red Square and Lenin's mausoleum, as well as the spacecraft Vostok, on which Yuri Gagarin, whom I adored so much, made the first journey into outer space. And I saw them all and even more. But do you know what was the most memorable moment of my trip to Moscow in 1986? It was tasting potato chips for the first time in my life. No, not because my parents never bought them for me, but because this kind of product simply didn't exist in my home city. Almost 40 years later, I still remember those chips in every detail. the stand at the Wedding where we bought them, the packaging, and of course the taste. How many of you who lived in the 80s remember the first time you tasted potato chips? I'm sure not that many, but I do. As well as the days when I tried my first bubblegum, yogurt, banana, and other products. Or the day learning something like existence of anesthesia during tooth extraction. That's how good the living standards were in the USSR. The land of socialist prosperity, where you could trade a Japanese VCR for a one-room apartment. Explaining the Soviet reality in just a few sentences is of course impossible, which is why I decided to start a second channel, Comrade Krupski, where I will cover the history of Russia, Imperial, Soviet or whatever, without limiting myself to aviation topics like on Paper Skies. On this new channel we will discuss Russian history in general, as well as dive into specific episodes, whether it's examples of the so-called high standards of Soviet living, or topics like how and why Russia exaggerates its casualties in World War II, as I'm sure I've already received furious comments claiming that 27 million Soviet people were killed by the Nazis. The first episode will be released in a couple of days, but you can already watch it on my streaming service Nebula, and doing so will be the best way to support my work on these new videos. As I'm sure you know, YouTube's current policies as regards channels covering history are quite harsh. YouTube is more interested in the comfort side of the viewer's experience rather than its educational side, which, if we are talking about real history, can be brutal. And thus YouTube limits the visibility of such historical videos. Many of my Paper Skies videos have been flagged for violating these guidelines. In fact, the original version of this very video was flagged as violating YouTube's guidelines. Which, to be honest, is extremely discouraging, that forces creators like myself to make quite a hard choice. Either pick safer, less compelling topics that align with YouTube's algorithm, or cover the important subjects while taking the big risk that such videos will possibly lose monetization. And making that choice is not that easy, as I'm not a big studio with a huge production budget. After all these years, it's still just me behind these videos. Launching this second channel is a big step forward for me in every way, as I hope to invite professional historians whose work has helped me learn the true history of Russia and the USSR, and the success of this new channel will help significantly in making that happen. I know I talk about Nebula a lot, and given that YouTube isn't likely to change its policies anytime soon, I'll keep doing so. Because Nebula isn't like other streaming platforms. It was built and is owned directly by us, the creators, making it the most sustainable way to support our work. When you sign up with my link nebula.tv/paperskies, I will get a portion of your subscription fee for as long as you are subscribed. With a Nebula subscription, you will also get access to my videos exclusive only to Nebula. And not just mine, Nebula houses dozens of unique exclusive projects like Red Atoms by Real Time History, Underexposure by Near Modern Conflicts by Real Life Lore, along with many more projects which, if not for the support of Nebula subscribers, wouldn't be possible, since it's too risky to produce them for YouTube due to its strict advertiser policies. On Nebula, creators don't need to worry about that, simply because there are no ads or sponsorship messages there, which is why the number of such exclusive videos is growing every day. You can get access to Nebula with my link in the description, which gives you an amazing 40% off on an annual subscription, bringing the cost down to just $3 a month. Or you can choose a lifetime membership, which allows you to pay only once to get unlimited access forever. Sign up using my link nebula.tv/paperskies to get 40% off on an annual subscription and support both Paper Skies and Comrade Krupski. And as always, thank you so much for watching.